They called themselves the Steel Riders, the most notorious motorcycle gang in the Pacific Northwest. For months, they'd been terrorizing every truck stop and diner along Highway 89 until they walked into Betty's Mountain View diner and met Frank Harrison. To them, he was just another 72-year-old rancher drinking his morning coffee, an easy target for their amusement. But when they mocked his worn leather holster and challenged him to draw, they made the deadliest mistake of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Highway 89 as it wound through the heart of Montana's Pine Valley. The asphalt shimmered like a dark river against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, their jagged silhouettes piercing the crystal-clear autumn sky. Betty's Mountain View Diner stood as an oasis for travelers and locals alike, its weathered sign creaking gently in the crisp mountain breeze that swept across the sprawling ranchlands. For 30 years, Frank Harrison had started his mornings the same way, arriving precisely at sunrise, settling into his corner booth and savoring Betty's coffee while watching the world wake up through the diner's panoramic windows. His weathered Stetson hung on the rack by the door, and the leather holster at his hip had grown smooth from decades of wear, a remnant from his days as the fastest U.S. Marshal Montana had ever seen. Betty Cooper, who'd owned the diner since, inheriting it from her mother 15 years ago, wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency, stealing concerned glances at the highway. "More coffee, Mr. Harrison?" she called out, though his cup was still half full. The morning regulars had grown sparse lately, ever since the Steel Riders had started claiming Highway 89 as their territory. "Appreciate it, Betty," Frank replied, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that hadn't faded with age. "Seems awful quiet this morning." His blue eyes, still sharp despite his 72 years, scanned the nearly empty diner. Only Emma Lawrence, the local high school teacher, sat at the counter, her breakfast growing cold as she watched the highway with obvious unease. "Fourth morning this week," Emma observed, her voice low. "They're getting bolder, riding through earlier and earlier." As if summoned by her words, the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder, like approaching thunder on a clear day. Sheriff Tom Wilson entered, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. He nodded to Frank, then settled onto a stool near Emma. "Morning, folks," he said, accepting coffee from Betty. "Suppose you've heard about the Sullivan Ranch incident." Frank wrapped his weathered hands around his coffee cup, the silver rings on his fingers catching the morning light. "Mike mentioned something yesterday. Vandalism? That's putting it mildly," the sheriff sighed. "Broke every fence along his north pasture, scattered his cattle halfway to Yellowstone, left one of their steel emblems welded to his barn door. Third ranch this month. First it was the Parker place," Emma added, pushing her plate away. "Then the Thompsons spread. Now this. They're working their way down Highway 89, marking their territory like real predators." The rumble of motorcycles grew louder. Through the diner's windows, they watched as 6 riders from the Steel Riders pulled into Betty's parking lot, their chrome and leather glinting menacingly in the morning sun. Their patches showed a steel fist crushing a skull against a blood-red moon, a sight that had become all too familiar along this stretch of highway. "Betty," Frank called softly, "might want to start some fresh coffee. Seems we've got company." His voice carried the same calm it had shown during countless standoffs in his younger days when his draw was legendary and his aim true. Those days were long past, or so most folks thought. The bell above the door chimed as the first 2 riders entered, their boots heavy on the worn linoleum. The leader, a tall man they called Ice, surveyed the diner with calculated menace. His eyes settled on Frank, noting the old man's worn holster with obvious amusement. Frank continued sipping his coffee, seemingly unperturbed by their presence. But Emma noticed how his right hand rested slightly closer to his hip, a gesture so subtle most wouldn't catch it. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, acutely aware that any wrong move could spark something none of them could control. "Well, well," Ice's voice carried artificial warmth. "What do we have here? Didn't know they still made cowboys like you, old-timer. Thought they were all in. Museums by now." The other bikers chuckled, spreading out through the diner with practiced intimidation. Betty's hands trembled slightly as she set fresh coffee cups on the counter, but her voice remained steady. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Oh, we're not here for coffee," Ice replied, his eyes never leaving Frank. "Just admiring the local. Color, that's quite a piece you're wearing, Grandpa. Family heirloom?" The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner's floor. In the distance, more motorcycles could be heard approaching. The steel riders were about to learn that some legends never fade, and some skills, like Frank Harrison's lightning draw, only grew sharper with age. The morning sun streamed through Betty's windows, casting long shadows across the diner's floor as Ice continued to circle Frank's booth, the biker's shadow falling across the worn tabletop like a gathering storm. "You didn't answer my question." "Old-timer," Ice pressed, his voice carrying the edge of someone used to immediate compliance. "That antique on your hip just for show, or do you actually remember how to use it?" Emma Lawrence watched from the counter, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. She'd only been teaching at Pine Valley High School for 5 years, but she'd heard the stories about Frank Harrison. The older residents spoke of him in hushed tones, tales of his legendary speed with a gun mixing with documented fact until it was hard to separate truth from legend. "Some things," Frank replied, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity it had for the 30 years he'd been coming to Betty's, "a man doesn't forget, like respect and manners." He lifted his cup to his lips, the morning light catching the silver rings on his fingers, rings that marked achievements most of the town's younger residents had never heard about. Betty Cooper moved with careful efficiency behind the counter, her movements carrying the weight of someone trying to maintain normalcy in an increasingly dangerous situation. Her mother had owned this diner when Frank was still actively working as a U.S. Marshal, tracking criminals and protecting the ranches that dotted the Montana landscape. She'd seen firsthand what he could do with that worn Colt .45. "Respect?" Ice's laugh carried no humor. "Times change, Gramps. Highway 89 runs on different rules now, Steel Riders rules." He leaned closer, his leather cut creaking. "And rule number 1 is understanding who's in charge." Sheriff Tom Wilson watched the exchange with growing concern. As much as he respected Frank's abilities, even at 72, the situation was becoming increasingly volatile. The Steel Riders had been systematically taking control of every establishment along their stretch of highway, using intimidation and violence to establish their dominance. "James," Frank addressed the sheriff without taking his eyes off Ice, "how's Katie doing with her barrel racing? Heard she took first place at the county fair." The seemingly casual question carried weight that only the diner's regular patrons understood. Katie Wilson, the sheriff's daughter, had learned barrel racing from Frank Harrison himself on the same ranch where he'd once trained lawmen in the art of the quick draw. Those sessions had stopped years ago, or so most people thought. "She's doing fine, Frank," the sheriff replied carefully, "using those techniques you taught her. Smooth and precise, just like you said." Ice's face darkened at being ignored. He moved to knock Frank's coffee cup aside, but before his hand could connect, the old rancher's fingers closed around his wrist. The grip, belying Frank's age, was like iron. "Son," Frank said quietly, "that coffee's still hot. Be a shame if anyone got burned." The other bikers tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Ice, looking into Frank's eyes, saw something that made him pause. There was no fear there, no uncertainty, just the calm assessment of a man who'd faced far worse than motorcycle gangs through the years. Through the window, more Steel Riders could be seen arriving, their bikes filling Betty's parking lot. The morning sun glinted off chrome and leather, casting wolf-head shadows across the pavement. Emma thought about her students, how the gang's presence had changed their lives. Parents were keeping their children closer to home, local businesses were closing earlier, and the vibrant community life that had defined Pine Valley was slowly being strangled by fear. "You know what I see?" Ice recovered his composure, jerking his hand away from Frank's grip. "I see a relic, a leftover from times that don't exist anymore. This isn't the Wild West, old man. Your kind is extinct." Frank took another sip of his coffee, his movements unhurried. "Might be right about that," he conceded. "World's changed plenty since my day." His eyes met Ice's, but some things stay the same. He paused, like the difference between seeming dangerous and being dangerous. The implied challenge hung in the air like smoke.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Betty's hand trembled slightly as she set a fresh pot of coffee on the burner, the familiar aroma mixing with the tension that filled the diner. Outside, more steel riders gathered, drawn by some instinctive sense that something significant was unfolding. "Tell me something," Frank continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent diner. "Those steel fists on your patches, did you earn them or just buy them? Because real strength, it knows better than to mistake quiet for weakness." The morning sun had climbed higher, its light catching the worn grip of Frank's Colt. The weapon wasn't just a relic of his past. It was a symbol of everything the steel riders thought they'd erased from Highway 89. Dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of men who didn't need to prove their power through intimidation. Ice's face darkened at Frank's words, his artificial composure cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. The other steel riders shifted position in the diner, their movements carrying predatory intent as they sensed their leaders growing. "Anger, you want to know about earning things, old man?" Ice's voice dropped dangerously. "How about I show you what we've earned? Boys, give our friend here a demonstration of steel rider hospitality." Before anyone could move, Frank's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. "Sheriff, might want to step outside with Emma and Betty. Things are about to get educational. In here." Despite the situation, his tone remained conversational, almost pleasant, but those who knew him recognized something in his bearing. A subtle shift from retired rancher to something else entirely. "Mr. Harrison," Emma began, concern evident in her voice, but Frank's slight smile stopped her. It wasn't the smile of a man in danger, it was the smile of a teacher about to deliver an important lesson. "Now, Emma," he said softly, "some lessons need to be witnessed from a safe distance." Through the diner's windows, more steel riders could be seen arriving, their bikes filling the parking lot and spilling onto Highway 89. The morning sun caught their chrome and leather, creating a menacing display of power. Inside, Ice's men had spread out, confident in their numerical superiority. "Last chance, Cowboy," Ice sneered. "Take off that gun belt, lay it on the table, and maybe we just rough you up a little. Keep it on, and we'll make an example of you, that Highway 89. Won't forget." Frank carefully set his coffee cup down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Funny thing about examples," he mused. "They work both ways. Been watching you boys work your way down this highway, spreading fear, thinking it makes you strong. Might be time for folks to see what real strength looks like." "Boss!" One of the younger riders called out, holding up a smartphone, his face showing confused recognition. "Been looking up our friend here, Frank Lightning Harrison. There's stories about him from back in the day. They used to call him the ghost of Highway 89, Sheriff Wilson finished from near the door, back when he was working as a U.S. Marshal. 9 shootouts, 32 arrests, and not a single casualty. They said he could disarm a man so fast. The bullet was still in the chamber when the gun hit the ground. Ice laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. That was what, 40 years ago? Look at him. He can barely hold his coffee cup steady. Age is funny that way, Frank replied, standing slowly. Makes some things harder, sure, but others, his right hand rested casually near his holster, just get smoother with practice. Like judgment, timing, knowing when a situation calls for speed and when it calls for wisdom. The tension in the diner had shifted. The younger riders still projected menace, but the older ones, those who'd grown up hearing stories of the legendary lawmen who once patrolled these highways, showed signs of uncertainty. "Think I read about you," one of them said slowly. "Weren't you the one who took down the Davidson gang, 4 men armed with automatics, and you dropped them all without killing a single one?" "That was a lifetime ago," Frank acknowledged. "Back when men who wanted to prove themselves did it face to face, not by terrorizing folks, just trying to live their lives." Ice, sensing his control of the situation slipping, moved suddenly. His hand dropped to his waistband, reaching for concealed steel, but before his fingers could close around his weapon, a sound split the air, a whisper of well-oiled leather, a click of aged metal, and suddenly Frank Harrison's Colt seemed to materialize in his hand. The movement had been so smooth, so blindingly fast, that several witnesses would later swear the gun had simply appeared. Even Ice, his own weapon only halfway drawn, froze in astonishment. "Now then," Frank said quietly, his aim unwavering despite his age, "seems like a good time to discuss the future of Highway 89 and how it might look different from what you boys had planned." The morning sun streamed through Betty's windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become legend in its own right. An old lawman standing against modern-day outlaws, proving that some skills never fade and some traditions never die. But what the Steel Riders couldn't know was that this moment wasn't just about one man's stand. It was about to become a turning point that would transform the entire region, starting with a demonstration of speed and skill that would remind everyone why Frank Harrison had earned the name Lightning in the first place. The diner had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the idle rumble of motorcycles outside. Ice stood frozen, his hand still hovering over his half-drawn weapon as he processed the impossible speed he'd just witnessed from a man old enough to be his grandfather. "That was your first mistake," Frank said calmly, his Colt remaining steady. "Assuming that because something's old, it's weak. Second mistake was thinking fear equals strength." His blue eyes swept the room, taking in each Steel Rider with the measured assessment of a man who'd spent decades reading similar situations. "Third mistake is coming up, trying to decide if you can still win this." Emma watched from near the door, her earlier fear replaced by amazement. In the 5 years she'd known Frank Harrison, she'd seen only the quiet rancher who occasionally visited her classroom to teach children about the area's history. Now she understood why her older students' parents spoke of him with such reverence. "You can't watch this whole highway forever, old man." Ice found his voice, though it carried less conviction than before. "We've got chapters in 3 states. This is just one diner on one stretch of road." "Interesting thing about highways," Frank replied, his tone conversational despite the tension. "They connect more than just places. They connect people, stories, legends." He shifted slightly, and somehow his stance became even more commanding. "Been making some connections of my own lately." Sheriff Wilson understood the implication before the others. He'd seen Frank at the Retired Marshals Association meetings, had noticed the quiet conversations with men who still carried badges and others who'd traded them for ranch jobs but hadn't lost their skills. "Got a call yesterday," Frank continued, "from an old friend down in Idaho. Seems the Steel Riders tried setting up there too, tried the same intimidation tactics on another relic, retired marshal named Bill Anderson. You boys might want to look him up, see how that worked out for your brothers." Recognition flickered across some of the older riders' faces. The Idaho chapter's sudden disappearance 2 months ago had been a mystery, but now pieces were falling into place. Betty Cooper moved carefully behind the counter, her movements deliberate as she reached for the old phone that hung on the wall. Like everyone else who'd grown up in the area, she knew the stories about the informal network of retired lawmen who still kept watch over Montana's highways. "That's right, Betty," Frank nodded, reading her intention. "Might want to make that a call we discussed. Let folks know it's time." Ice's composure cracked further. "Time for what, old man? Your senior citizen patrol?" "Time to remind everyone that some traditions don't die," Frank replied. "That some men don't stop being who they are just because the world changes around them. Each of those ranches your chapter's been terrorizing. They're not just victims. They're links in a chain that runs deeper and stronger than you boys can imagine." Through the diner's windows, more dust could be seen rising on Highway 89. But these weren't motorcycles approaching. They were pickup trucks, ranch vehicles, and the distinctive profile of police cruisers from 3 counties. "See, while you boys were building your little empire through fear," Frank continued, his voice carrying decades of earned authority, "I've been making calls, talking to old friends, men who haven't forgotten what these highways mean, what they represent. Real strength doesn't just mark territory, it protects it." One of the younger riders moved suddenly, perhaps hoping to take advantage of Frank's divided attention. The old man's response was so smooth, so blindingly fast, that even those watching closely couldn't follow the movement. Somehow, without seeming to shift position, Frank had drawn a second Colt, covering both sides of the diner. "That's another mistake to add to the list," he said quietly. "Thinking speed is just for the young. What you boys don't understand is that true speed, the kind that matters, comes from something deeper than muscle. It comes from knowing deep in your bones exactly what you're capable of and exactly what you stand for." The approaching vehicles were close enough now that their details became clear. They carried men that some of the older steel riders recognized. Former marshals, retired sheriffs, ranch detectives who'd never quite hung up their badges, men who, like Frank Harrison, had spent decades protecting these highways and the communities they connected. "Last chance, boys," Frank offered, his guns unwavering. "Way I see it, you've got 2 choices. You can be smart, lay down your weapons, and learn about respect the easy way. Or his smile carried no humor. "You can be like your Idaho brothers and learn about it the hard way. Either way, Highway 89 is about to remember what real law looks like." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the diner's floor. In those shadows, the steel riders were about to learn that some legends don't fade with time. They just wait for the right moment to remind everyone why they became legends in the first place. The tension in Betty's Mountain View diner crystallized as the convoy of vehicles pulled into the parking lot, surrounding the steel riders' motorcycles. Through the windows, Frank Harrison's words were proving prophetic as familiar faces emerged, men carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of long-time lawmen. "Let me tell you what's really happening here," Frank continued, his Colts steady as heartbeats. "Right now, Bill Anderson is leading a similar group in Idaho. Jack Thompson has another in Wyoming. Remember the Davidson gang I mentioned? Jack's the one who taught me about dual-wielding these Colts. He's 80 now, but his hands are still steady enough to sign death warrants or offer second chances." Ice's face contorted with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. His carefully constructed image of power was crumbling, replaced by the realization that he'd unknowingly challenged something far older and more organized than he'd imagined. "That's impossible," he snarled, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone watching their world unravel. "You're bluffing. No way you old-timers could organize something like this." Frank's laugh carried genuine amusement. Son, we were organizing takedowns while you were still learning to ride with training wheels. These highways, they're not just roads, they're lifelines connecting communities, families, traditions, every diner, every ranch, every small town. They're all part of something bigger, something you boys tried to break. Outside, more vehicles arrived. Emma Lawrence recognized some of the men emerging from them, fathers of her students, retired lawmen who now worked as ranchers or security consultants, men who, like Frank, carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who'd spent their lives standing against chaos. "Know what your real mistake was?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Thinking that because we retired, we stopped being who we are. Thinking that because we chose quiet lives, we forgot how to be dangerous." Betty Cooper moved carefully behind the counter, her hands steady now as she poured coffee for the men filing into the diner. Each newcomer took up positions with practiced efficiency, their movements suggesting years of tactical experience. "Bill Anderson sends his regards," a weathered man in his 70s announced, his voice carrying the gravel of too many desert patrols. "Says to tell you the Idaho chapter of the Steel Riders sends their apologies, all 23 of them, from jail." Ice's remaining bravado crumbled. "You're crazy, old man, all of you. This isn't the Wild West anymore. You can't just—" "Can't what?" Frank cut him off. "Can't protect our own, can't stand together against men who mistake cruelty for strength?" His smile carried decades of earned confidence. "Way I see it, you boys have been writing checks your courage can't cash, thinking nobody would stand against you. Time to learn about real courage." Sheriff Wilson moved with professional authority, coordinating with the newly arrived reinforcements. The Steel Riders found themselves facing not just Frank Harrison's legendary speed, but a carefully orchestrated response from men who'd spent their lives dealing with threats to their communities. "Here's what happens next," Frank announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "You boys are going to lay down your weapons, slowly and carefully. Then you're going to learn about something your kind never understood, the difference between taking and earning respect." One of the younger riders, panic overriding judgment, made a sudden move for his concealed weapon. Frank's response was so smooth, so blindingly fast, that even those watching closely couldn't follow the movement. The young man's gun went spinning across the floor, his wrist caught in a grip that belied the old lawman's age. "That speed," Frank said quietly, "isn't just about quick draws anymore. It's about choosing faster than thought between stopping a threat and offering redemption. Your choice now is simple. Face charges for everything you've done along Highway 89, or help us clean up the mess you've made." The morning sun streamed through Betty's windows, illuminating a scene that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Steel Riders' attempt to rule through fear had collided with something they couldn't intimidate or overwhelm: the unbreakable bonds of men who'd spent their lives protecting these highways and the communities they connected. Outside, more vehicles arrived, carrying the weight of lore and tradition. The Steel Riders were about to learn that some forces can't be broken by modern methods, some strengths don't fade with age, and some legends don't just tell stories. They remind everyone why they became legends in the first place. The breaking point had arrived, not just for the Steel Riders, but for every outlaw group that had mistaken these quiet highways for easy territory. Frank Harrison's stand wasn't just about one diner or one stretch of road. It was about to become a turning point that would remind everyone why the old ways and the old guardians had never really gone away. The next few moments in Betty's Mountain View diner unfolded with the precise choreography of men who'd spent lifetimes handling similar situations. Frank Harrison kept his Colts trained on strategic points, while retired lawmen moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, disarming Steel Riders and securing weapons. "Had an interesting conversation last week," Frank said conversationally, his aim never wavering despite his apparent casualness. Seems your chapter's been busy up in Yellowstone too. Interesting thing about Yellowstone, they've got their own relic up there. Man named Carl Martinez, retired park ranger, runs a small outfitter's shop now. Your boys thought he'd be an easy target. Ice's face showed recognition, then concern. The Yellowstone operation had gone silent 3 days ago, with no explanation from their brothers there. Martinez, Frank continued, he's got this interesting philosophy about young wolves who don't know their place. Says sometimes they need to be taught by the old wolves who marked the territory first. Sheriff Wilson coordinated with the arriving reinforcements, his movements carrying the weight of official authority backed by decades of experience. Got word from state police, he announced. They're moving on Steel Rider chapters in 3 counties. Seems our friends here have quite a record. Extortion, vandalism, assault. List keeps growing. The younger riders looked increasingly uncertain, their bravado crumbling as they realized the true scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about one old cowboy and one diner. It was about an entire network of men they'd dismissed as relics, men who'd never stopped protecting their communities. You know what real power is, son? Frank addressed Ice directly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. It's not about how loud your bikes are or how many people you can frighten. It's about the quiet strength of men who stand together, who remember what these highways mean, what they represent. Betty Cooper moved behind the counter with renewed confidence, serving coffee to the gathered lawmen. Her hands no longer trembled. The fear that had gripped Betty's Mountain View diner for months was dissolving in the presence of real strength. Your daddy, Frank continued, his eyes fixed on Ice. He worked the lumber mills, didn't he? Hard man, tough job. Betty taught you about respect, about earning your place. Somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons, started thinking fear was the same as strength. The mention of his father hit Ice like a physical blow. His face showed a flicker of something beyond anger or fear, perhaps the first glimpse of recognition, of understanding how far he'd strayed from the values he'd been raised with. Emma Lawrence watched from near the door, grading papers forgotten in her hands as she witnessed what would surely become local legend. Her students' parents had told stories about the old guardians of Highway 89, but seeing them in action, seeing how their quiet strength could overcome modern threats, was something else entirely. Got another call coming in. One of the retired marshals announced, his phone displaying messages from across the region. Chapters falling in 3 states. Seems our friends here didn't realize how many relics were watching, waiting, remembering what real law looks like. Frank's stance shifted slightly, though his aim remained perfect. Time to make a choice, boys. Way I see it, you've got 2 paths ahead. One leads through every courthouse in 3 states, facing charges that'll keep you riding prison yards instead of highways. Other path, he paused, his voice carrying a hint of hope. That one's harder, but it leads somewhere better. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across Betty's floor. In those shadows, the Steel Riders faced a moment of truth, not just about their immediate future, but about the very nature of strength and respect. Your bikes, Frank continued, they're not just machines. They're freedom, power, brotherhood. But you boys twisted that, turned something noble into something ugly. Question is, are you ready to remember what real brotherhood looks like? Outside, more vehicles arrived, not just law enforcement now, but ranchers, business owners, community leaders who'd suffered under the Steel Riders' reign of terror. They came not for revenge, but to witness the moment when their highways would be reclaimed by men who understood the true meaning of protection. Last chance, Frank announced, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. Choose your path. Show these highways whether you're wolves or just pups playing at being dangerous. The The moment stretched like wire under tension, ready to either snap or reshape itself into something new. Highway 89 and all the communities it connected waited to see which path the Steel Riders would choose and what that choice would mean for the future of their shared roads and shared destiny. If you're finding this confrontation as intense as we do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means everything to us. Now, let's see what choice these young riders will make. The diner's phone rang, cutting through the tension like a steel blade. Betty Cooper answered it, her voice steady as she handed it to Frank Harrison. Without lowering either colt, he activated the speakerphone, letting everyone hear the graveled voice that emerged. "Lightning, it's Martinez up in Yellowstone. Got your message." Networks activated. Every retired lawman from here to Idaho is either on the road or coordinating with local authorities. Just like Jackson Hole in '89, brother. Frank's slight smile carried decades of shared history. Just like Jackson. "Oh, Carl, remember what you told me then about wolves and territory?" Martinez's laugh carried through the speaker. "Old wolves might get gray, but their teeth stay sharp. My boys have already rounded up the Yellowstone chapter. Seems these young pups forgot that real wolves protect their territory, not just mark it." Ice's face showed growing comprehension as he realized the true extent of what his gang had stumbled into. This wasn't just about one old lawman or one diner. It was about an entire network of men who'd never stopped watching, never stopped protecting their communities. "Got Bill Anderson on the other line," Martinez continued. "Says Idaho's secure, Thompson has Wyoming locked down." The old network never died, Lightning, just went quiet, waiting for the right moment. Emma Lawrence watched in amazement as more vehicles arrived outside Betty's Mountain View diner, each carrying men who moved with the unmistakable bearing of experienced lawmen, some retired, some still active, all responding to a call that transcended official channels. "Tell them about Bozeman," one of the older Steel Riders spoke up suddenly, surprising everyone. "My uncle was there, told me stories about how a handful of marshals and local lawmen stood against 40 drug runners. Said there was one man, they called him Lightning." "That's ancient history," Frank cut in, though his eyes showed appreciation for the recognition. "Today's about writing new history, about showing these highways what real protection looks like." Sheriff Wilson coordinated with the arriving reinforcements, his radio crackling with updates from across 3 states. The Steel Riders' carefully constructed empire was crumbling, not under the assault of rival gangs or federal authorities, but under the coordinated response of men they dismissed as relics. "Networks reporting activity all along Highway 89, a retired marshal announced, checking his phone. "Every chapter's being contained. Sons and grandsons of old lawmen joining in, making their own legacy. This isn't just about stopping them anymore. It's about showing them a better way." Frank kept his colt steady, but his voice carried a teacher's patience. "You boys thought you were building something, thought fear and intimidation could give you control. But real control, real respect, that comes from protecting, not threatening, from standing together, not standing over others." Betty Cooper served fresh coffee to the gathering of lawmen, her movements carrying new confidence. Through the diner's windows, more dust clouds approached. Not just law enforcement now, but regular citizens, community members drawn by word of what was unfolding. "Martinez," Frank spoke into the phone, "remember what you used to say about redemption, about how even the youngest wolf can learn new ways? Still believe it, Lightning. Question is, do these young ones want to learn? Do they want to understand what real strength looks like?" The morning sun cast long shadows across Betty's floor as Frank Harrison faced the Steel Riders, his stance unwavering despite his age. This moment wasn't just about ending their reign of terror. It was about offering them a choice, a chance, to understand the true meaning of the power they'd misused. Networks standing by, Martinez's voice carried authority even through the speaker. "Every old guardian from here to the state line is ready, just like the old days, when we kept these highways safe not through fear, but through something stronger." Outside, the gathering of vehicles and men had transformed Betty's parking lot into a demonstration of quiet strength. These weren't just retired lawmen responding to a threat. They were guardians, awakening to remind everyone that some traditions never die, some bonds never break, and some men never stop protecting what matters. The Steel Riders faced a moment of truth, surrounded by men who'd spent lifetimes understanding the difference between seeming dangerous and being truly strong. The network that had awakened wasn't just about enforcement. It was about transformation, about showing younger generations that real power comes from protection, not intimidation. If you're as captivated by this showdown as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let's see how this moment of truth unfolds. The morning air. In Betty's mountain view, Dinah crackled with tension as Ice faced the moment that would define not just his future, but the future of every Steel Rider present. Frank Harrison's Colts remained unwavering, but his eyes carried something beyond threat, an offer of understanding, of potential redemption. "Your father," Frank said quietly, addressing Ice with unexpected gentleness, "worked the Morrison lumber mill, didn't he? Tom Davidson, tough man, honest worker. Used to stop here every morning before his shift, back when my hands were steadier and his were still strong." The mention of his father's name hit Ice like a physical blow. His carefully constructed facade of menace cracked further, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before the Steel Riders. "How did you—" he started, his voice carrying genuine surprise, because those of us who watched these highways, we knew everyone's story, every worker, every family, every dream these roads carried. Frank's voice took on a teacher's patience. "Your daddy wanted more for you than mill work, saved every dime he could for your college fund. What happened to that dream, son?" Through the diner's windows, more vehicles arrived, but now they carried familiar faces, local ranchers, business owners, community leaders who'd suffered under the Steel Riders' reign. They came not seeking revenge, but drawn by the possibility of witnessing transformation. Networks reporting similar situations across the region, Sheriff Wilson announced, checking his radio. Steel Riders everywhere facing the same choice. Continue down a path of destruction or remember who they were before the patches and violence. Sarah Chen watched from her position near the door, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just about ending the Steel Riders' control, it was about offering them a way back to something better, something real. "Got word from Bill. Henderson," one of the retired marshals called out. "Idaho chapter's already turning. Young riders there remembering their own fathers, their own forgotten dreams. Some are breaking down, asking for a chance to make things right." Frank's aim remained steady, but his voice carried decades of earned wisdom. That's what these highways have always been about. Not just connecting places, but connecting lives, giving people chances to choose better paths, to remember who they really are. Betty Cooper moved behind the counter, her movements carrying new purpose. She placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Ice's usual spot, a simple gesture that carried profound meaning. It was an offer, a reminder of the community he'd once been part of. "Your mother still works at the hospital," Frank continued, his words striking deeper than any bullet could. "Night shift nurse, just like always. Keeps your photo in her locker, not the one with the patches and anger, but the one from your high school graduation. The one where you still knew how to smile without threatening." Ice's hands trembled slightly, his carefully constructed image of power crumbling in the face of remembered truth. Around him, other Steel Riders showed similar signs of internal struggle, as if awakening from a long, dark dream. "Network standing by," Martinez's voice came through the speaker, carrying ancient understanding. But this isn't about overwhelming force anymore. It's about choosing, about remembering that even the fiercest wolf can find its way home. Outside, the gathering had transformed Betty's parking lot into something remarkable. Law enforcement. Vehicles stood alongside ranch trucks and family cars, their drivers united not just against the steel riders, but for something larger, the possibility of redemption. "Got a call from your old wrestling coach last week," Frank revealed, his words carefully chosen. "Remember Coach Phillips? Still talks about the kid who never quit, who understood that real strength wasn't about dominating others, but about mastering yourself." The morning sun painted long shadows across the diner's floor, but they seemed less menacing now, more like bridges between what was and what could be. The Steel Riders faced not just physical surrender, but a deeper choice, a chance to rediscover the men they were meant to be. "Time to choose, boys," Frank announced, his voice carrying finality without threat. "Not just about today, but about every tomorrow that follows. These highways can be paths of fear, or they can be roads back to something better, something real." The moment stretched like dawn, breaking over the Montana horizon, full of possibility, of potential transformation. In Betty's Mountain View, Dinah, surrounded by men who'd never forgotten the true meaning of strength, the Steel Riders faced their moment of truth. Their choice would echo, not just through their own lives, but through every community their highways connected. If you're moved by this moment of truth, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep bringing you powerful stories like this. Now let's see what choice these young men will make. The first crack in the Steel Riders' unified front came from an unexpected source. A younger member, barely in his 20s, stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture that carried more than simple surrender. "My grandfather," he said, voice shaking slightly. "He worked highway patrol out of Bozeman, used to tell me stories about men like you, Mr. Harrison, about what these roads meant, what they stood for." He reached up slowly, deliberately, and removed his Steel Rider's patch. "I forgot those stories somewhere along the way, forgot who I was supposed to be." Frank Harrison's aim remained steady, but his eyes showed understanding. "What's your name, son?" "Michael. Michael Reynolds. Grandfather was James Reynolds." "Good, Jim." Frank nodded, recognition warming his voice. "Good man, solid lawman. Saved my life once outside of Livingston. Bet he never told you that story." Other Steel Riders shifted uncomfortably, watching their youngest member break ranks. But in his action, they saw something that spoke to buried memories, to forgotten promises and abandoned dreams. Networks reporting similar movements across the region, Sheriff Wilson announced quietly. Young riders remembering their roots, their family legacies. Idaho chapters almost completely surrendered, many asking about making amends. Ice watched his carefully built empire crumbling, not through force, but through something more powerful, the awakening of conscience, the remembrance of better paths. "Your father," Frank continued, addressing Ice directly, "he didn't just work the mill. He was a volunteer firefighter too, spent his weekends teaching kids about safety, about protecting instead of destroying. Wonder what he'd think about what his son's been building out here on Highway 89. Betty Cooper moved with quiet purpose behind the counter, setting out more coffee cups. Each cup represented more than refreshment. It was an offer of return, of community, of belonging to something real. "Got word from Martinez," one of the retired marshals called out. "Yellowstone chapters turning 2. Seems when young wolves remember their true pack, their true purpose, the false pack loses its hold." Through Betty's windows, more vehicles arrived, but now they carried different passengers, parents, teachers, community members who'd watched their young men disappear into the Steel Rider's shadow. They came not seeking vengeance, but carrying hope for restoration. "Remember your first bike?" Frank asked Ice, his voice carrying memories. "That old Indian your daddy helped you rebuild, spent every weekend for a year working on it together. Wasn't about power then, was it? Wasn't about frightening people or marking territory. It was about freedom, about family, about earning something real." C.T. Tales Dostai. Emma Lawrence watched the transformation unfolding before her, understanding dawning in her teacher's heart. This wasn't just about ending the Steel Riders' reign. It was about reclaiming lost sons, about showing them the way back to who they were meant to be. Another rider stepped forward, then another. Like a dam breaking, the carefully constructed facade of menace began to crumble, each man facing not just surrender to authority, but surrender to truth, to the reality of who they'd been before the patches and violence. Networks got rehabilitation programs ready. Martinez's voice came through the speaker, not just about punishment, about restoration, about helping these young ones find their way back to the right path. The morning sun had climbed higher, its light seeming to wash away shadows, both physical and spiritual. In that light, the Steel Riders faced not just the consequences of their actions, but the possibility of redemption. "Last summer," Frank said quietly, his words carrying to every corner of the diner, "your mother came in here, Ice, sat right where you're standing now. Talked about the little boy who wanted to be a mechanic, who dreamed of opening his own shop. That dream's still there, son, just buried under all these false ideas about power and respect. If you're touched by this moment of transformation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of redemption like this. Now, let's see how these young men find their way back home." The transformation continued, not with the thunder of violence, but with the quiet power of truth. Each Steel Rider faced not just Frank Harrison's legendary speed, but his deeper wisdom, his understanding that real strength lies not in breaking things, but in rebuilding them. "Choice is yours now," Frank announced, his voice carrying no threat, only opportunity. "These highways can be roads to redemption or paths to prison. The network stands ready not just to enforce, but to help rebuild, to show you what real brotherhood looks like." The moment stretched like a Montana highway at sunset, full of possibility of potential transformation. In Betty's Mountain View diner, surrounded by men who'd never forgotten the true meaning of strength, the Steel Riders faced not just surrender, but salvation. Their choice would echo not just through their own lives, but through every community. The highways connected. Ice stood motionless, his world crumbling around him as more of his men laid down their patches. His eyes locked onto the old coffee cup at his usual spot, the one his father had used years ago, the one Betty Cooper still kept waiting, holding on to hope for the boy who'd once been part of this community. "Your daddy's hands," Frank continued, his Colt steady but his voice gentle. They were always stained with sawdust. "Honest work," he called it. Said a man's hands tell his story. What story are your hands telling now, son? Ice looked down at his own hands, adorned with rings meant to intimidate, calloused not from honest labor, but from violence. Something shifted in his expression, like ice breaking on a winter river. "Networks reporting from Yellowstone," Sheriff Wilson announced quietly. "Martinez says they're getting calls from Steel Riders' families, parents, siblings, all asking about second chances, about ways back home." The morning sun streamed through Betty's windows, catching the silver in Frank's hair and the worn leather of his holsters. Those watching saw not just an old lawman with fast hands, but a bridge between what was and what could be. "Remember your senior year?" Frank asked, his words carrying memories Ice had tried to bury. "State championships. Your dad worked double shifts to buy you that new wrestling gear, said his boy was going to make something of himself. Still can, you know." Betty Cooper moved behind the counter, pulling out an old photograph she'd kept, tucked away. A younger Ice in his wrestling uniform, smiling with his father's arm around his shoulders. She placed it carefully on the counter, another piece of the bridge home. "Got something else to show you," one of the retired marshals called out, holding up his phone. "Your father's outside. Been there since we called him, waiting to see if his son remembers who he really is." Ice's composure cracked completely. The facade of the fearsome Steel Riders leader fell away, revealing the lost son beneath. His hands, those hands meant for honest work, began to tremble. "Network standing by." Martinez's voice came through the speaker, carrying ancient wisdom. "But this isn't about punishment anymore. It's about restoration, about helping lost wolves find their way back to the right pack." Through the diner's windows, more community members gathered. They watched not with anger, but with hope, understanding that this moment wasn't just about ending the Steel Riders' reign. It was about reclaiming their sons, their brothers, their neighbors. "Your mother's rosary," Frank said softly. "She still keeps it in her nurse's station, prays every shift for her boy to find his way home. Those prayers carried more power than all your Steel Riders ever did." Emma Lawrence watched as another transformation unfolded, recognizing in her teachers that redemption often comes not through force, but through remembering who we were meant to be. "Got reports from across Highway 89, Sheriff Wilson updated. Steel Riders everywhere laying down their patches, not just surrendering, asking about making things right, about rebuilding what they broke. Michael Reynolds, the young rider who first stepped forward, moved closer to Ice. "Boss," he said quietly, "maybe it's time. Maybe we all lost our way, trying to be something we're not." The morning had grown warmer, but the heat that filled Betty's Mountain View diner wasn't from the Montana sun. It was the warmth of possibility, of prodigal sons finding their way home. "Your father's shop," Frank continued, "still has that empty bay, the one he kept hoping you'd come back to. Still has your name on the toolbox, still has dreams wrapped up in those quiet spaces. If you're moved by this story of redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories like this. Now, let's see these lost sons find their way home." Ice's hands moved slowly to his leather cut, fingers tracing the steel fist patch he'd once thought meant everything. Now it felt like a chain binding him to a path he'd never truly wanted. "Network's got programs ready." Martinez's voice carried hope through the speaker. "Not just about paying debts, about rebuilding lives, about remembering that even the fiercest wolf needs a true pack, a real purpose." The transformation continued, not with the thunder of motorcycles, but with the quiet power of truth. Each Steel Rider faced not just surrender, but the possibility of reclaiming their abandoned dreams. "Choice is still yours," Frank said, his aim unwavering but his voice carrying a father's patience. "But remember, real strength isn't about how many people fear you. It's about how many people you protect, how many lives you make better." The moment stretched like a Montana horizon, endless with possibility. In Betty's Mountain View diner, surrounded by men who'd never forgotten the true meaning of strength, Ice faced not just the end of his Steel Riders chapter, but the beginning of a new story. His choice would echo not just through Highway 89, but through every life his actions had touched, every dream his violence had shattered, and every path to redemption now opening before him. With movements that seemed to carry the weight of years, Ice slowly reached up and gripped his Steel Rider's patch. The sound of tearing leather cut through the diner's silence as he pulled it free, leaving a darker square on his vest where fear and power had once resided. "My father," Ice's voice cracked, sounding younger suddenly, more like the boy who dreamed of owning his own shop. "He really comes by here every morning?" 7 a.m. sharp. Betty Cooper answered softly, pulling out a worn coffee cup with Tom written on the bottom. Same cup, same seat, same prayers for his son. Through Betty's windows, a figure became visible. A man in sawdust-covered work, clothes standing among the gathered crowd. Tom Davidson's weathered face carried neither judgment nor condemnation, only the patient hope of a father waiting for his son's return. Networks reporting similar scenes across 3 states, Sheriff Wilson announced, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. Families reuniting, sons coming home, bridges being rebuilt. Frank Harrison's Colts remained steady, but his eyes showed understanding of the transformation unfolding before him. Your daddy taught you about tools, he said softly. Said every tool can either build or break, depends on the hands holding it and the heart guiding those hands. More steel riders followed their leader's example, patches falling like autumn leaves. Each torn piece of leather represented not just surrender, but awakening, a return to forgotten truths and abandoned dreams. Running bears on the line, one of the retired marshals called out. Says the Yellowstone chapter's not just surrendering, they're asking about apprenticeships, about learning trades, about building instead of breaking. Emma Lawrence watched from her position near the door, recognizing the profound education happening before her. This wasn't just about ending violence. It was about showing lost souls the way back to themselves. Your mother, Frank continued, his words striking deeper than any bullet could. She keeps a box of your childhood drawings. Remember those? All those sketches of cars you wanted to fix, shops you wanted to build. Dreams don't die, son. They just wait for us to remember them. Betty Cooper moved with quiet purpose, placing a fresh cup of coffee at Ice's usual spot. Not the spot he'd claimed through intimidation, but the one he'd inherited from his father, the one that held generations of honest work and true respect. Got word from across the state line, Sheriff Wilson updated. 3 more towns want to start similar programs. They're seeing that real change is possible when communities stand together. Through the diner's windows, more dust clouds approached. But these weren't reinforcements coming to end a siege. They were families, community members drawn by word that their lost sons were finding their way home. Networks established rehabilitation. Programs in every major town along Highway 89, Martinez's voice carried through the speaker. Not just about punishment, about restoration, about showing these young ones that real power comes from protecting, not destroying. If you're touched by this story of redemption and renewal, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories of transformation like this. Now let's see these prodigal sons complete their journey home. 1 year after the standoff at Betty's Mountain View Diner, Frank Harrison sat in his usual spot, watching the morning unfold. The diner had filled early today as people gathered to mark the anniversary of the day that changed Highway 89 forever. But this wasn't just a celebration of the past. It was a testament to ongoing transformation. Network's final annual report shows implementation in 12 states now, Sheriff Wilson announced to the gathered crowd. Over 1,000 former gang members successfully rehabilitated through the program, crime rates down 70% across participating communities. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Tom Davidson's auto shop had expanded to 3 locations along Highway 89, with Ice, now known again as Marcus Davidson, overseeing a comprehensive program that combined technical training with life skills and community service. The waiting list stretched months ahead, filled with names of young men seeking their own path to redemption. Got word from Martinez, one of the retired marshals called out. International delegations arriving next week, police forces from 5 countries coming to study the model. They're calling it the Montana Transformation, how one community's response to violence became a blueprint for change. Betty Cooper moved through the packed diner, serving coffee to faces that told the story of real transformation. Former riders sat with the lawmen who'd once hunted them, planning future projects together. Community leaders shared tables with reformed gang members, discussing new initiatives. "Your mother's garden," Tom told Marcus with quiet pride. "It's becoming more than we ever imagined. They're using it as therapy now, showing troubled kids how nurturing something beautiful can heal what's broken inside." Frank watched the scene with satisfaction, his weathered hands wrapped around his morning coffee. "Your father's dream," he observed to Marcus, "it's grown into something that's changing the world. You're not just fixing machines anymore, you're fixing broken systems." Through Betty's windows, the evidence of lasting change was everywhere. The community center bustled with activity as Michael Reynolds coordinated a mentorship program that paired former gang members with at-risk youth, breaking the cycle of violence before it could begin. Networks established permanent operations in over 100 towns, Sheriff Wilson reported. Each success story spawns new requests. Communities are seeing that real change isn't just possible, it's sustainable when people work together. Emma Lawrence shared updates from the education system. The first wave of students influenced by the transformation were now graduating, many heading to college or trade schools, their paths forever altered by what they'd witnessed. "Remember what you used to say about custom builds?" Tom asked his son as they viewed plans for the next training center expansion. "How every project needs a vision of what it could become. That's what we're doing here, helping people envision better versions of themselves." The morning sun painted Highway 89 in shades of possibility. Where fear had once ruled, hope now flourished. Each former rider had become a living testament to the power of transformation, their stories inspiring others to seek their own path to redemption. Running Bear's latest assessment, a marshal announced, shows the model spreading beyond gang rehabilitation. Communities are applying these principles to other social issues, seeing results nobody thought possible. Betty had expanded the diner's museum, adding a research center where scholars studied the transformation process. Each artifact, each photograph, each documented success story contributed to a growing body of knowledge about community rehabilitation. "Your impact," Tom told Marcus proudly, "it's becoming something permanent. You're not just changing lives anymore, you're changing how people think about redemption and recovery." Frank sipped his coffee, watching new arrivals through the window. More success stories, more communities seeking guidance, more proof that what had started in Betty's Mountain View diner had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Networks. Reporting interest from social scientists worldwide, Sheriff Wilson updated. They're studying how one community's response to violence created a model for sustainable social change. The morning stretched like a Montana highway, endless with possibility. In Betty's Mountain View diner, surrounded by living proof that transformation was possible, something profound had taken root. It wasn't just about ending gang violence, it was about creating a new understanding of how communities could heal themselves. Through the diner's windows, Marcus could be seen teaching a new class of students, his presence now a symbol of possibility rather than threat. His story, a testament to the power of second chances when communities choose restoration over retribution. The transformation had become more than a program or a model. It had become a movement, showing that real change was possible when people dared to believe in redemption, when communities stood together, when hope was offered instead of fear. What had started with one old lawman's stand had grown into something that would continue changing lives for generations to come. 6 months after the confrontation at Betty's Mountain View diner, the transformation along Highway 89 had become a nationally recognized model of community rehabilitation. Frank Harrison sat at his usual spot, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky in shades of gold. But today was special. A documentary crew had arrived to tell the story of how one old lawman's stand had sparked a movement. Networks reporting. Implementation in 7 states now, Sheriff Wilson announced during the morning briefing. What started here has grown beyond anything we imagined. They're calling it the lightning strike model. How quick, decisive action combined with community support can transform lives. Tom Davidson's training center had become a flagship operation, with Marcus leading programs that had already graduated over 100 former gang members into skilled trades. The waiting list grew longer each week as word spread about second chances and real opportunities. Got word from Martinez, one of the retired marshals called out. Federal task force is using our data as a case study. They're seeing recovery rates they never thought possible. Over 90% of graduates staying on the right path. Betty Cooper moved through the busy diner, serving coffee to the mix of journalists, community leaders, and success stories who'd gathered to share their experiences. The documentary crew captured every interaction, every smile, every moment of genuine transformation. Your mother's garden, Tom told Marcus with pride. It's becoming famous in its own right. They're calling it the Garden of Second Chances, where former riders learn patience, nurturing, and the joy of watching good things grow. Frank watched the scene with quiet satisfaction, his experienced eyes taking in details the cameras might miss. Your father's vision, he observed to Marcus, it's grown into something that's changing lives across the country. You're not just teaching trades now, you're teaching hope. Through Betty's windows, the evidence of change was everywhere. The community center buzzed with activity as Michael Reynolds led a youth mentorship session, showing kids that strength comes from building up, not tearing down. Networks established permanent programs in 50 towns, Sheriff Wilson reported. Each success story leads to more requests. Communities are seeing that real change is possible when you give people the tools and trust they need. Emma Lawrence shared statistics from the school district. Dropout rates had plummeted, college applications had soared, and vocational program enrollment was at an all-time high. The transformation had reached into every corner of community life. Remember what you used to say about diagnostic work? Tom asked his son as they demonstrated repair techniques for the cameras. How you have to listen to the engine to understand what it needs. That's what we're doing here, listening to people's stories, understanding their needs. The morning sun streamed through Betty's windows, illuminating a scene that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Former enemies worked side by side, building something stronger than the fear that had once divided them. Running bears. Latest report, a marshal announced, shows similar programs starting spontaneously in other regions. The model's proving itself. When you give people a real chance at redemption, they usually take it. Betty Cooper had transformed the diner's wall of photographs into a proper museum, documenting the journey from confrontation to transformation. Each image told a story of change, of hope, of lives rebuilt from the ground up. Your impact, Tom told Marcus proudly, it's reaching further than we ever dreamed. You're showing people that it's never too late to choose a better path. Frank sipped his coffee, watching new arrivals through the window. More documentary crews, more community leaders seeking to understand the miracle of Highway 89. More young men looking for their own path to redemption. Networks got requests from 3 more countries, Sheriff Wilson updated. Word spread internationally. They want to understand how we turned a crisis into an opportunity for community healing. The morning stretched like a Montana highway, endless with possibility. In Betty's Mountain View diner, surrounded by living proof that change was possible, something profound had taken root. It wasn't just about ending violence, it was about creating a new model of community transformation that could be replicated anywhere. Through the diner's windows, Marcus could be seen leading a certification ceremony for new graduates. His presence now a symbol of hope rather than fear. His story a testament to the power of redemption when communities stand together. The transformation had come full circle, from a moment of confrontation to a movement of restoration. What had started with one old lawman's stand had grown into something that would continue to change lives long after the cameras stopped rolling, showing that real strength comes not from causing fear, but from having the courage to help others find their way home. 1 year after the standoff at Betty's Mountain View Diner, Frank Harrison sat in his usual spot, watching the morning unfold. The diner had filled early today as people gathered to mark the first anniversary of the day that changed Highway 89 forever. But this wasn't just about celebrating the past. It was about witnessing an ongoing transformation. Network's final annual report shows implementation in 12 states now, Sheriff Wilson announced to the gathered crowd. Over 1,000 former gang members successfully rehabilitated through the program, crime rates down 70% across participating communities. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Tom Davidson's auto shop had expanded to 3 locations along Highway 89. With Marcus overseeing a comprehensive program that combined technical training with life skills and community service. The waiting list stretched months ahead, filled with names of young men seeking their own path to redemption. Got word from Martinez, one of the retired marshals called out. International delegations arriving next week, police forces from 5 countries coming to study the model. They're calling it the Montana Transformation, how one community's response to violence became a blueprint for change. Betty moved through the packed diner, serving coffee to faces that told the story of real transformation. Former riders sat with the lawmen who'd once hunted them, planning future projects together. Community leaders shared tables with reformed gang members, discussing new initiatives. The sun climbed higher over Highway 89 as Betty's Mountain View Diner continued, its transformation into something more than just a restaurant. Frank Harrison watched from his usual spot as the legacy of that fateful morning continued to unfold before him. Networks reporting implementation in 15 states next month, Sheriff Wilson announced during the morning briefing. But more importantly, we're seeing second-generation changes now. Children of former riders choosing positive paths from the start, breaking cycles of violence that once seemed unbreakable. Tom Davidson's training empire had become a model studied worldwide, but the original shop where everything had started remained Marcus's personal project, a place where he worked one-on-one with young men seeking their own path to redemption. Got word from Martinez, one of the retired marshals called out. United Nations is sending representatives next week. They're looking to implement similar programs in conflict zones worldwide. Seems what started here on Highway 89 might help heal wounds far beyond Montana. Betty Cooper moved through the busy diner, serving coffee to a mix of faces that told the story of true transformation. Former enemies had become partners in rebuilding, their shared commitment to positive change stronger than any gang ties had ever been. Your mother's garden, Tom told Marcus with quiet pride. It's becoming a place of healing for the whole region. People come from hundreds of miles away just to walk through it, to see how beauty can grow from the hardest soil. Frank watched the scene with satisfaction, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the lasting change. Your father's vision, he observed to Marcus. It's become something eternal now. You're not just changing lives, you're changing how people think about change itself. Through Betty's windows, the evidence of transformation was everywhere. The community center buzzed with activity as Michael Reynolds coordinated an international conference on community rehabilitation, sharing the lessons learned from Highway 89 with delegates from around the world. Networks reporting similar movements, starting spontaneously in other countries, Sheriff Wilson updated. They're adapting our model to their own cultures, their own challenges. The principles of redemption and community support prove universal. Emma Lawrence shared stories from her newest students, children who'd never known the fear that once ruled these streets, growing up in a community that believed in second chances and the power of transformation. "Remember what you used to say about engines?" Tom asked his son as they worked together in the shop. "How every broken machine has a story to tell. Now you're helping people tell new stories, write better endings." The morning sun painted Highway 89 in shades of promise. Where fear had once ruled, hope now flourished as an established reality. Each former rider had become not just a success story, but a mentor, helping others find their way. Running Bears. Final assessment, a marshal announced, shows something remarkable. The changes we're seeing aren't just lasting, they're growing, evolving, becoming stronger with each generation. Betty had transformed the diner into more than just a restaurant or museum. It had become a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of community and the possibility of redemption. "Your legacy," Tom told Marcus proudly, "it's becoming something immortal. Long after we're gone, people will still be finding their way home because of what started here." Frank sipped his coffee, watching new arrivals through the window. More seekers of change, more believers in redemption, more proof that what had begun with one stand against fear had grown into an eternal promise of hope. Network's got a new name now, Sheriff Wilson shared. They're calling it the Eternal Route because the path to redemption never closes, never ends, just keeps offering new chances to those brave enough to take them. The transformation had become more than a program or movement. It had become a permanent promise, showing that real change wasn't just possible, but inevitable when communities chose hope over fear, redemption over revenge, and love over hatred. What had started with one old lawman's courage had grown into something that would continue changing lives long after the original participants were gone. An eternal testament to the truth that the human spirit's capacity for transformation knows no bounds when given the chance to remember its true nature. The sun climbed higher over Highway 89, casting its light on a legacy that would continue illuminating paths home for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.